I'll definitely work in the other stuff as well. So you folks are garden club members. Anybody want to introduce yourself and tell me what kind of gardening you're thinking about doing this year?
I'm doing a little raised bed in my backyard. Is it too early or too late to start?
Well, hopefully you'll find some things during this talk that you can get started right away, and some really neat techniques to get a jump on things.
What are the best seeds? Will we find that out to start now?
Oh, I definitely have opinions on that. Yeah, there's definitely some companies that are better than others, but also some of the best ones are the ones you save yourself.
Raised bed here too, so.
Great. Yeah, just so makes your back feel a lot better and lets you get started a little sooner.
I don't know.
Anybody have trees that they're going to be pruning?
Oh, I have a blackberry bush that I first year with that. I have no idea how to prune it.
They're a little different than the blueberries and the apples, actually. I think that you can work on those actually in the summertime after they fruited. You cut back the stuff that's fruited. I can double check on that, but most familiar with the blueberries and apples because that's what I have.
I have a hard time moving starting seeds inside and then getting them to transfer outdoors.
Yeah, that it's so disheartening too when you've taken care of them for so long, having to say goodbye to them too quickly. So hopefully we'll address some of the frequent issues seen in transplanting. All righty, well, I'm just gonna go ahead and start rolling. So I've been gardening for probably about 20 years now, and I've been with Extension for 6, 7 years, and just working with community gardens and different gardeners. I've really picked up a lot of tips and tricks for making seed starting very successful, money saving, and just a really exciting part of this time of the year. So why grow plants from seed when you can buy them already grown, right? You can go to the garden center, they're ready for you, they go out in the garden and happily live their life. Why would you want to start in the bleak winter months and take on such responsibility? Well, a lot of the reason why I grow plants from seed is just because I like a lot of different variety. I love to explore unusual colors, textures, sizes. For example, I grow a lot of cut flower varieties. Cut flowers the varieties grown for cutting are often much taller, are bred to have different vase lives, and they're just not something you're going to find at the garden center. So if you want to grow those varieties, you absolutely have to get them and grow them from seed. Also, if you want to grow things like purple broccoli or yellow carrots, those aren't something that you can just get at the garden center. You have to start those from seed. Also, it's just so much more affordable to grow from seed. When you think about it, you can get seed packets from the dollar store. I think they're 4 for $1 or 3 for $1. And a lot of those varieties are perfectly good. So literally from pennies, you can grow entire plants. Whereas transplants, it seems like they're getting more and more expensive. In fact, unless you have a good kind of independent garden center around you, it can be very expensive to grow vegetables. The big box stores like Walmart and Home Depot that sell the Bonnie brand plants, they're big, healthy plants, but you're going to pay like $5 for one tomato plant. And if you have a big garden, that's prohibitively expensive. Another thing is just you have the ultimate control over your growing conditions. You can decide whether you go completely organic, regenerative, holistic. You can really grow in line with your values and health concerns. When you buy something from a garden center, you don't know if it's been treated with pesticides or other chemicals that could possibly be harmful for you and or pollinators. And for me, part of the excitement is just getting my hands dirty so early. You know, I'd say November, I never want to garden again. I'm over it. I'm tired of it. Put it to bed, get that dirt away from me. But by January, I'm ready to get into it again. So, um, I actually started my very first seeds of the year today, onion seeds. I like to grow, instead of buying onion sets, I like to grow onions from seed. And so Valentine's Day just about is when those go in. In the past, I've actually grown some flowered varieties that needed to be started in January and February, but this year I am buying those in as what are called plugs. These are even smaller than the transplants you get at the garden center, but you get about 100 of them to 200 in a tray, and little teeny tiny, and you get very good wholesale pricing. So also it's just fun and educational to grow plants from seed, right? Um, you know, especially if you've got little ones in your life, whether it be kids or grandkids, for them to see where their food comes from, the entire cycle of life. It's just, I learn something every time I grow plants from seed. So where can you buy your seeds? And I mentioned that I have opinions. Um, for the big community gardens that I run, I buy most of my seeds from Johnny's. They're a Northeastern company. They really focus on varieties that do well in our climate. They have very sustainable growing practices. They're good to their workers. So I like to support them there. But most of all, the quality is good. For the community garden, we have a generous benefactor who buys the seeds. So it's okay that they're a little bit on the expensive side, because the trade-off is that we know that everything's going to come up really high germination rates, and that we won't have a crop failure that will cause problems for a lot of people. We know we're going to get what we pay for it with that. So they have a physical catalog that you can order from. You can call in your orders, but for the most part, I order online. Just about every seed company now has pretty good online platform. You can also buy seeds from your nicer nurseries. In fact, some of the independent nurseries will have really good seeds like Botanical Interest or Renee's Garden, some of the more unique things. The problem is a lot of the nurseries aren't open until later in the year. So some of our seed varieties that we need to start much earlier, we might not have access to in a nursery. The big retailers seem to have their seeds out already, and I've been pleased to see that the variety is getting better and better. I think since the pandemic, more people have gotten interested in gardening. So the retailers have responded with more seeds, more variety, more organic options, and just I think they sell better for them now. So that's exciting. Seed swaps, they're going on all over the place, getting more and more popular. They happen in our local libraries here. The Otsego Master Gardeners just had a really big seed swap down there in Oneonta. Also friends. If you have friends, I'm a good person to be friends with if you like seeds. I always have plenty, and I love to swap and try new varieties, especially things that people have saved themselves, that varieties that are special to them or to their family. Those are always really interesting to grow. So, but there are a lot of other really good seed companies. You know, I mentioned online. Baker Creek is one of my other favorites. They sell a lot of heirloom varieties. They're good quality. There's Territorial. Fedco is another really good Northeastern company. Seed Savers Exchange. So there's just so many options.
Well, excuse me,
Yes.
where do you order for plugs?
Plugs, I work through a company called Ball Horticultural. They do work with smaller growers. They're meant to be wholesale. But if it's a situation where you're doing like larger beautification projects, or you're having a plant sale, something like that, they'll work with you on that. They don't generally work with individual homeowners just because the quantities are so large. So they generally work with businesses. Another way to get the plugs is through a guy called Farmer Bailey. He's online, and he works exclusively with Grow and Sell out of Pennsylvania, but he's just kind of a middleman, and his ordering platform is so much easier than Ball Horticultural, and his pricing is the same. And then on Facebook, there's a group that's called Plugs for the Small Scale Grower, I think, where it's more of a swapping type platform, where, or not a swapping platform, but like a co-op. And, you know, you order plugs. It doesn't have to be hundreds of them. It can be like 20 or 50 and you pay for them and they're sent to you. But my understanding is that there's a lot of drama in that group. I've never tried it, but that's another way you can get them. And then there's also the option of working with your local nursery. And, you know, if it's a family owned business, to see if they'll either custom grow for seed from you or buy in the wholesale plugs and give them to you at a markup. That would be less than their full size transplant price. So options for getting those too. Okay, so I'm just with you guys being in a garden club, you probably know all about plant life cycle, but I'm just gonna kind of breeze through it as it relates to seed starting. So annuals, most of the vegetables that we're gonna grow, and a lot of the flowers are annuals. And it's something that you grow for one season. You're gonna start the seed in that year. It's going to do whatever it is that you want it to do, whether it create a big green leafy mass for you to put in your salad or for it to make a fruit or seeds for you to consume. It'll do that in one season. Biennial, it actually takes 2 years. And so some of the more commonly known biennials are things like foxglove, where you have this kind of low mounding rosette the first year, and then it overwinters, the leaves die back, but then come back in the spring, get the flower makes seeds, and then that's the end of the plant. Actually, though, I just found out the other day that onions are actually technically biennials. For our purposes, they're annuals. We grow them in one season, right? But they'll grow 1 year, and then if they overwinter, we'll set seeds the next year for a lot of the varieties. So, and then perennials are the ones that the gift that keeps on giving. They come back year after year after year. Some varieties are not as hardy as others. We consider those tender perennials. They may only last a season or two, or 2 to 3 seasons. But other perennials, you plant it once, it just keeps dividing and comes back all the time. Okay, then we get a little bit more complex with the genetic terminology. You hear the term hybrid a lot. And in fact, I had a friend in Texas reach out and say, where can I buy seeds? I just want heirloom. I don't want to mess around with any of those weird hybrids. And so it really had a negative connotation to her. Whereas for tomatoes, I only buy hybrids because they have the disease resistant qualities I want. And so just because something is a hybrid, that's no affiliation with genetic engineering, actually. That just means that the 2 different plants have been intentionally crossed to get the desired offspring. And you're only going to get those characteristics by that specific cross. Heirloom varieties are something that have been grown and handed down from generation to generation. It's something that can self-pollinate and really hold the same characteristics over and over. Open pollinated and heirloom are pretty similar. It's just the heirloom has more of that sort of provenance of being handed down, whereas open pollinated just means that you can save the seeds. It's going to breathe true to type. Okay, other terminology that you might see on your seed packet. The term organic, if you are a certified organic grower, you must buy organic seeds. And, you know, thinking about a little seed, it's not going to hold that much pesticide that comes over with it from the parent plant, but it's just all about the ethics involved in growing organically. So in that movement with that type of certification, you have to support those practices. But at the seed level, of course, there's not going to be residual pesticides that you're worried about. we are seeing more and more availability of organic seeds. In fact, the pricing isn't that much different. So if that's something ethically you want to support, absolutely go for the organic seed. There's also, you can get seed that is treated. Usually organic seeds are not treated because the chemicals used to treat them aren't certified organic. With things like peas and corn, these big seeds that sometimes go into wet soil and have a tendency to rot, they'll treat them with a fungicide that can improve germination and growth. And then there's also coatings that can go onto seeds. A lot of your little tiny things like carrots and Lysianthus, just itty bitty dust-like seeds. They actually provide those in a form that's coated for better handling and improved germination. Now, GMOs, you're not going to see I used to say, oh, you'll never see GMOs in seed for home growers, but that's starting to change actually. In the past, it's really just been more of a focus on big field crops, things that are fed to animals to make them big, to impart characteristics like herbicide resistance, so that herbicides can be used in increased amounts. But I just read the other day that a breeder used genetic engineering to introduce a snapdragon gene into tomatoes to make pure purple tomatoes. And this is going to be available to home growers, and they are allowed to save seeds from it. So it is a brave new world. And these are characteristics that have been introduced to improve the nutritional quality and the appearance of the fruit, the tomato, and they're not really being done to promote a chemical or anything like that. So I think you'll start to see more applications like that. And it's just really up to the individual to do their research, ask questions, and decide if that's a technology they want to embrace or not. Okay, so this is the question we get all the time. When do I sow my seeds? What's too early? What's too late? And there really is kind of a narrow window for a lot of the varieties that we like to grow. And it's based on your average last frost date. If you look at seed packets, they'll say, you take your last frost date and count back, or they'll show a little map about the times you're supposed to show. In Delaware County, it's technically around June 1st, but we're seeing two different things happening now. Number one, we're dealing with some climate change issues, so temperatures are overall warmer. However, we do get crazy weather events where we can have a super late frost. I think it was just 2 or 3 years ago, we had a frost on June 17th. So what I'm telling people now is to be ready to go put things out right around what is their average last frost date, but to be ready with frost protection, like floating row cover. And I'm certainly happy to tell you more about that as we go through the talk. So Johnny's does have a really nice growers seed planning calculator online where they tell you can type in your last frost date, and it will populate it with when you should start each variety from seed. But so much does have to do with when do you want to harvest it. Certainly, if you want to have your lettuce come on a little bit earlier, you could start it earlier than recommended, but that also means you're going to be taking care of bigger plants in bigger pots. They're going to take up more room, and they're going to be more difficult to transplant when the time comes. So pretty much what the seed companies give you are good things to go by. But as you get more advanced with your seed starting, well, you might start to tweak it just to get a specific production time. Or if you're planning on saving seeds from something, you may have to start it quite a bit sooner so that it's able to complete its life cycle in our very short growing season. Okay, so what do you start inside? What do you start outside? The things that I consider, a bunch of different things, but is your season long enough to grow that variety from seed outside? something like your worm-loving tomato plant or pepper that starts little tiny and takes forever to grow, that you're going to have to start that inside. Also, how hard is it to germinate? Are you going to have to be really fussy and do a dance around it and have the light and humidity just so? If that's the case, it's something you're going to want to do inside where you control it. How well does it respond to transplanting? Some things like cucumbers and squash, they hate to have their roots messed with. So they're really better off direct seeding them if you can. Available space and equipment, you know, if you only have just one warm windowsill and that's where you want to put everything, you're probably best off buying most of your stuff as transplants, or doing things that you can direct sow outside. If your seed is kind of rare and expensive, you might want to start inside where you can baby it rather than putting it out in the elements, right? And then finally, weeds and pests. If you have pristine weed-free soil, you're going to have a lot easier time starting seeds out there than if you have a whole mess of weeds. In fact, one year I was so excited, I planted radishes and I saw those first little sprouts come up. And then I realized that I didn't plant that many radishes. And it was just something else from the mustard family, probably garlic mustard, that was just there in the soil in abundance. And it was all coming up and I couldn't tell the radish from the weeds. So, you know, this is just a little side note on soil prep. One of the techniques that's really coming into favor these days is called silage tarping. So there's this black plastic that's UV stabilized. Another term for it is a bunker cover. It's seen in agricultural uses. It can be bought in rolls and sheets, but it's different from the sort of tarps that you'd buy at Home Depot in that it's not woven, it's solid, and it is UV stabilized. It's not particularly thick, but it works for its purpose. So if you spread that out over the area that you want to plant at least 3 weeks before your plant date, I would say more like 4 to 6 in my experience. You roll that out, weight it down with rocks, you know, let the sun bake down on it. And what it does is it causes the seeds that are near the top of the surface to germinate. And the resulting plants don't get any light, so they fizzle and die. And also any sort of vegetation underneath like grass will die and put nitrogen into the soil. So this is how I've been prepping new beds for my little flower farm. And it's worked really, really well. And it's also something I've implemented at the community garden that I run, that I put just when we finish up with the bed in the fall, you know, if we're not going to cover crop it, if we've pulled out all the plants, we've topped it off with compost, we go ahead and cover it over with the silage tarp. And this is in a raised bed that's 4 foot by 36 foot. We just have rolls that are that size. We roll it out and just leave it there till we're ready to plant in the spring. And it's so nice just to pull that cover off and be ready to go. The plastic actually has a warming effect on the beds, so we can get in there a little bit sooner. The snow and ice tend to go away faster. It's great for planting peas. Okay, so what plants should you start indoors and not outdoors? I mentioned already things that just have too long of a season. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. A lot of your flowers that they take a very long time to grow. Most of your perennials. In fact, not only do they need to be started indoors early, but they also might need a little bit of treatment, which I'll talk about later, to be able to germinate. That said, there are some techniques for starting seeds outside in the very cold weather. I'll talk about that too. So also, if I'm wanting to get a really good start on the early season varieties like broccoli, kale, cauliflower, lettuce, I'll start those in March and put them out in April or early May. So they love then you have a nice size transplant to put out when it's still nice and cool, because once it gets hot, they are not happy. And then you've got your slow growers like my onions that are sitting back behind me. Celery, parsley, those need a very early start indoors. Those are not something you can grow from seed in one season here. Okay, but what can you direct sow? I mean, there's so many things that are not only easy to direct sow, but they like it even better. And these, thankfully, are things that, at least in the first group, the legumes, these are big, easy to handle seeds. Your beans, peas, nasturtiums. It does help to give them a little bit of soak, maybe the night before. Go ahead and let them imbibe and then put them out the next day. So my trick with peas, I told you about my silage tarp trick, but I like to soak the peas and then I actually plant them out like right around St. Patrick's Day. If I can get out there, if the soil, if we're not covered in snow. And then I will go ahead and put some little wire hoops and some row cover over them just to give them a little bit of extra warmth. But they don't care that it's you're still going to get snow and freezing. If you've given them that pre-soak to kind of wake them up, you're going to get a nice harvest of peas in late June, early July. So that's a good trick to get them out early. Other things that are much better to direct sow are your cucumbers, squash, and melons, also pumpkins, just because the roots are very sensitive. They're big seeds. The plants come up pretty quickly as long as it's warm enough. You do want to wait till your risk of frost is past. If you do need to get a little bit earlier start and start them inside, I recommend doing them in good sized peat pots and then planting the entire thing. Don't remove the pot, just plop the pot and everything in, and that won't disturb them. It's also your root crops like radish, beets, carrots, and turnips. Those are good to direct sow. Carrots, you can't do anything but direct sow. Anybody who's ever tried to plant and transplant a carrot has gotten some good looking science experience. That's right. It's just they don't like it. But those seeds do really well just planted right out. Other things that are great to direct sow, sunflowers. One issue you might have with sunflowers are the critters like to dig them up and eat them, or the birds will take them. So I make little cloches out of soda bottles. I just cut them in half, cut the top off, and use that to give a little bit of warmth and protection. And then, of course, you direct seed corn and cilantro as well. So what do you need to start seeds indoors? There's so many things you can use, anything from paper cups to cafeteria trays. It's great to recycle. So don't feel like you have to go out and buy expensive containers to do seed starting, or save your containers from the nursery the previous year. You'll need a starting mix that you can either make yourself or buy commercially. I always just buy it pre-made, less thinking and work for me. Something to label with. And then you need to create the right environment for seeds. And seedlings do need quite a bit of light. So in most cases, you're going to need a light source other than just a window. You'll need a way to either make the room warmer or cooler, depending on the situation. You'll need to be able to provide water, and then air circulation is important as well. So here are some examples of recycled containers. Toilet paper rolls work really well. You can also make little pots out of newspaper just by rolling it around a mason jar. There's all kinds of tutorials on Pinterest. There's deli containers work well. Not a huge fan of egg cartons, except for the smallest of seedlings, just because they're not very deep. They're a little bit too shallow. And of course, you can buy all kinds of different trays of different orientations. I'm a fan of the Jiffy pellets and pots. They're easy. It's fun to treat them, the pellets especially, to treat them with hot water and watch them expand. You can get them in different sizes. And then the pots I mentioned are great for starting these things that don't like their roots handled. My thing that I do most of my seeds with now these days are soil block makers. These are the coolest little things. They're almost like cookie presses or something that you bang into your soil mix and then just put down a tray and plant individual seeds into the cubes. And for, I'd say 90% of the flowers that I grow, I use the smaller cubes and plant them out at a pretty little size. For things that are bigger, you can put the smaller blocks into larger blocks or just plant directly into the larger blocks. The advantages are, of course, the space saving. In one little cafeteria tray, I can get, I believe it's 160 seedlings. So that's a lot of plants. Also, because they're individual blocks, the roots do what is called air pruning, and they kind of just cease their growing, so you don't get this big tangle of roots. It's focused more on green leafy growth. They're eco-friendly because you're not using any plastic. There's no waste at the end of it. Disadvantages, though, you turn your back for a minute, they dry out. They can be fragile, especially after you first made them and planted them. If you pour the water on them too hard, they're just going to dissolve. So once the plant starts growing in there, they become a little bit more stable. Also, the blockers can be relatively expensive. I think the smaller ones are in the $30 range, $20 or $30 range. But as you get into the bigger ones, they are quite a bit more expensive. But it's a one-time purchase if you take care of them. Okay, seed starting mix. Like I said, I used a pre-mix. For the most part, I buy the Jiffy brand just because that's what they have at my Ace Hardware. It's affordable, it's organic, it seems to work really well. If you are growing in huge quantities, you can make your own with peat moss. I would buy the compost rather than using my own just because of the chance of weed seeds being in there. And then just things for the pH and fertilization. But I have found I do like the finer textured mixes just for the smaller blocks. Okay, a neat addition to you can use is vermicompost. There are factors within the worm poop that does seem to stimulate root growth and green leafy growth. I generally don't incorporate it into my mix. Rather, I take the vermicompost that I've made myself and I make a little tea out of that and use that to water my seedlings. Okay, so when you are going to plant, you break into your mix, your bag of mixture, and you'll find it to be very dry. And what a lot of people do is they just put it in their pot, plant their seed, and then water it. And it makes a big mess because the mix is very hydrophobic, doesn't tend to want to absorb the water. So what I like to do is just put the dry mix into a tote, add the water, mix it up real good, and then put it in the pot. Or alternatively, you can put the mix into a flat and water it in. You just need to be patient and don't try to plant the seeds until you've got it fully wetted. And so moisture is something people really struggle with because the tendency is to overwater and to have it too boggy, but that's honestly worse than having it too dry. You really want to keep an eye on your plants and the soil and really only water when it's genuinely dry. So that it takes a little bit of experimentation to get to the point where you're really comfortable with knowing if your plants are happy or not. And you know, you can use a fine sprayer or a watering can, whatever works for you. Labels my thing is I'll plant something in a certain pot and say, oh, I remember what's in here, and I never do. So labeling is very important. You can certainly buy plant markers. In fact, I buy very thin plastic ones on Amazon. You get thousands of them for not a whole lot of money, but certainly there's ways to recycle things. You can use forks or cut up solo cups, mini blinds, so many different options. The one recommendation I have, though, is to get what's called a garden marker. I have one around here somewhere. You can get them on Amazon, other places, but it's something that won't lose its pigmentation in UV. Regular Sharpie markers will fade over time, no matter what you write on them with. So if you're planning on putting the markers outside at any point, you definitely want to get something that's UV stabilized. Okay, and then lighting. I get a lot of questions about this, and there are so many options. Really, only natural lighting works if you're in a situation where you have a skylight or a very large south-facing window that gets a lot of sun during the day. But most folks are going to need artificial lighting. Good old-fashioned fluorescent bulbs are great. They lose their effectiveness over time, but you can mix cool and warm bulbs to get the full spectrum of light that you'll need. And they'll also give you a little bit of added warmth that will help with the warmth for your seedlings needs for growth. But it's getting harder and harder to find the old-fashioned fluorescents. And the good news is LEDs have gotten really good. They've come down in price quite a bit. I've been using LED shop lights for seed starting for the last couple of years, and they work just as well as the fluorescents for me. So heats, most varieties need a little bit of bottom heat to get started. Some of them need heat throughout seedling development. But there are some varieties that don't like heat at all. They prefer to be started in cooler conditions. So you just really have to do your homework for each variety that you're starting. But, and just like the lights, heating mats have come down in price. You can get them pretty affordably. Appliances don't give off as much heat as they used to, so they're not as a reliable a source for getting things started. You can always bring a space heater into your growing space, and then you can do DIY things with incandescent Christmas lights. So you can get creative with that, but the things that I use bottom heat for are peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, things that I don't use them for, some of my flower varieties like snapdragons that are sort of cooled season varieties, they don't need it. Okay, moisture, again, I mentioned this can be tricky for folks. You really, if you're worried that your soil will dry out before germination, you can cover with plastic wrap or use humidity domes. However, if it's too wet, then it's going to create too much moisture in there. And also, if you're adding bottom heat, be very careful because you can create an environment that'll just cook your seedlings if it's too hot. So in fact, some of my heat mats that I bought off Amazon, I think are too hot. And what I do is I put down a kitchen, like a terry cloth towel, a couple layers just to sort of create a barrier between the flat and the heat source. But there's different ways to maintain that moisture. One way to do it is bottom watering, which is you can see in the bottom picture. That's a good way to get water in there without disrupting your plants or seeds on top. But you do need to know what you're doing so the moisture stays consistent, and careful overhead watering. It's really good to have a watering can with a very narrow opening on it rather than just glugging the water on. Okay, so this is a picture of a DIY grow system, and then there's one right there in the background. I don't know if you can see it. I had my overhead light on, but there was a glare off of the aluminum foil I have on the wall. So I turned it off, but this is just a simple wire shelving and shop lights, basically, is what it's made out of. And I've been using the system for years and grown numerous plants under it. It's very simple. It's just your shelving unit, shop lights. You do need a timer because you're not going to remember to turn the lights on and off at different times of day. Timers are very affordable. An outlet strip so that you can plug in multiple lights and heating pads if you need to, and then some extra S hooks. And so you can get into something like this from $250 to $300 as opposed to thousands of dollars for a commercially available growing system. And this is just sort of the breakdown of what it costs. And this has probably changed. This is a few years ago. Everything seems to be getting more affordable as far as seed starting supplies go. Not anything else, but seed starting supplies. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few strategies that you can do to increase your productivity over the season. What you do want to think about, though, are things we've already talked about. How long does it take to get to maturity? Is it a rare seed? Is it something that you have a lot of? When can I harvest it? What is my available spacing? And do I have time to care for baby seedlings? Okay, so one way to do it, if you've got a ton of seed, you can just sow a bunch of seeds just to ensure that you're going to have a lot of plants come up. And then what you're going to do is thin them out to get the spacing that you want. So this is great if you've got like an old pack of seeds that you just want to use up, you know that the germination might not be as great as it once was. And this way you can kind of select the best seedlings and pluck the rest out. The advantages are you are going to have to thin them at some point, and you're going to think that's a pleasant task, but I don't like pulling up baby seedlings. It kind of makes me sad. And they just do risk damaging the surrounding plants. And it's just more work when you've already got a lot going on that time of year. But one fun thing to do is you can use those thinnings as microgreens. So if you don't feel as bad about it if you're putting it in your salad, right? Okay, another thing that you can do are take the little seedlings, pluck them out of whatever container you've started in them, and just keep moving them up into larger containers as they grow. And this will allow you to give them more time inside because otherwise they're going to get pot bound and not be happy, and improve the root development. But the disadvantages are it does take up more room. You're going to need the containers and soil. And you have more chance of killing them. The longer you hold on to them, the more chance there is that some major malfunction will happen and your plants will die. That's at least in my case. Another strategy that I use a lot is succession planting, sowing the same seeds every few weeks so that I know I have it throughout the season. If you plant radishes once, you're going to have radish seeds. You're going to have nice radishes in like, what, 35, 40 days. But that's it. No more radishes the rest of the season. Certainly there's times of year where the radishes don't grow as well. So maybe, do a couple successions in the spring, couple successions in the fall, just so you maximize the amount of radishes. Things like cilantro, I just throw them out every few weeks, just so I'm sure to have it all the time. As I mentioned, though, the conditions aren't always right for germination. So you have to really know what your season is and what varieties you're working with. Another strategy I do is I'll start my seedlings inside, something like kale, but when I put out those transplants in a space next to them, I'll put in some seeds so that I know that I'll have the next succession coming along right behind the first one. Okay, and then one thing that you can do as well is that you can grow things with different maturity dates. So for your very earliest tomatoes, your sweet 100s, it's only 60 days to maturity. You're going to be enjoying those great little cherry tomatoes, where it's going to be like in another 15 days, you're going to have your early girls. And then finally, much later in the season, you'll have your beefsteaks. I will say, it seems like the tomato diseases are getting worse and worse, and that combined with climate change, it's really tricky to grow those very long season tomatoes. Even though they're delicious, I tend to focus more on hybrids that get to maturity very quickly so there's not as much risk of disease setting in. And I've even started succession planting my tomatoes so that I have some that I've started the seeds in May. I'll get fruit in, say, late July, early August. And when those are starting to peter out, the ones that I started in May anyways, they're started a month apart so that I have tomatoes all through the season. Okay, so I mentioned seed pre-treatments. Your beans, your peas, things like that, they love a good 8 to 12 hour soak just to plump them up. So that starts to trigger all the physiological factors that will get the seed germinating. Scarification is another technique for things like nasturtiums, lupins that have hard coats. That in combination even with imbibition, just a little nick of the coat, improves germination. And then a lot of your perennials need what is called stratification. So they need kind of a freeze-thaw cycle to efficiently germinate. So you can mimic this either in your home refrigerator, or you can plant things out in pots and put them outside. And then another technique that I'm going to talk about quickly is winter sowing. I have that slide a little bit further down. Okay, so when you're planting seeds, you do want to keep depth in mind, whether you're inside or out. You don't want to plant it any deeper than its diameter, just because it's a lot of work for that little seed to push up through the soil. Bigger seeds obviously have more energy stored and are tough enough to get up through, but tiny seeds are not. The reason why you want to put bigger seeds in deeper is just so the critters won't take them, and that they stay consistently moist that they need. So some seeds, your larger seeds, you want to try to arrange that the shoot end is up if you can see it. But in most cases, the seeds will find their right way round, because nature just drops them onto the soil and they figure it out. And then you do need to decide how you want to arrange it. We grow biointensively, meaning that we grow everything as close together as possible, and we actually use a staggered orientation, but some things you may want to just broadcast, especially if you're going to be thinning them to the spacing that you want, or you can sow in a straight line. Okay, so caring for your seedlings. We've talked about, sure, it's easy enough to start a seed, but how do you take care of it? Before it germinates, the main thing is that you just keep consistent moisture and the appropriate temperature. But once it germinates, then that's when the work starts. If you do have some of humidity cover, you do want to remove that so that it is getting good air transfer. And some varieties require a different temperature for growing on that they do for germination. Some of them need maybe a warmer germination, but need to be cooler as they grow. Then as they're growing, just keep them watered. And one thing you do want to be mindful of is the pH of your water. If you have sulfur water or well water that's extremely alkaline, you might want to just go ahead and maybe collect rainwater. If you have a pond outside, get water from your pond. Or even if you have really terrible water, you might want to just buy water from the store. In fact, we have really water at our office, and we have one of my coworkers has all kinds of house plants, and she brings them water, so she won't use that stuff. So I don't drink it either. But as the plants grow, really keep in mind their needs for the light source. Most plants are happy to have the lights on 12, 14 hours a day. Some need any more depending on what you're growing. And some want actually less because you don't want those developmental cues of the longer days for them to start setting seed. So it's really a case-by-case basis on what you're growing. You do want to feed them as they grow. That's one mistake people make. They think that everything they need is right there in the soil, but it's not. Most potting soils do have the initial fertilizer, but once you get those true leaves, you do need to give them a weak fertilizer. I use fish emulsion. It's affordable. It smells terrible. Plants love it. It's just a couple tablespoons per gallon. I put it in a little milk jug and water them through until they're ready to go out. And then before you transplant, we've talked about how, yeah, I've grown these seedlings, but then they don't do well when I put them out. What's going on? They really need to go through a hardening off process. So for me, it's about a week that I go through hardening off, maybe 5 days to a week. I start them out with just a few hours outside in a shady spot. You don't want to hit them with that harsh sun or wind. They're not used to that. They've been in a really loving, protecting environment. And no matter how bright your grow lights seem inside, they're not nearly as bright as the sun. So we've really got to get them used to that. So what I do is I put them underneath a picnic table. just for a few hours. Then I'll bring them back in and then gradually increase the time that they're outside. Another strategy that I use is I just put the flats into raised beds and put shade netting over the whole thing so that it's a little bit less harsh of environment. And then bit by bit, I remove the shade cover for longer amounts of time. So that's a little bit easier than carrying them in and out. And yeah, just get them hard enough, literally. And by the time you get them out in the soil, they're happy, they're ready to go. One trick I do use for my warm loving plants like peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, squash, is I do keep them under floating row cover for the entire month of June, just because we do have the really cold nights and we have quite a bit of wind in our location. So I like to keep them extra cozy, and the things that like it hot like that, they're very appreciative. Okay, common problems that you see if you don't see germination. It could be that you got a bad pack of seeds, but more likely it's just a moisture issue or temperature. If you're getting into perennials, native plants, things like that, it could be that they need a pre-treatment. So you could do a Google search of that variety and see what they need. If they're lakey and light colored, they're probably just not getting enough light. Even if you have the grow lights, you really want to have them as close to the seedlings as possible. Damping off is a situation where the seedlings they look perfect, everything's fine, and they just fall over and die. And that's because they've gotten an infection, they're in unhappy conditions, usually too cold and wet, or you use pots that weren't clean enough. Generally, I'm not too fastidious about washing my pots just because I never see disease develop in the pots. Now, if I was growing something year round and if we had diseases, then I'd worry about it more. And stunted yellow seedlings, they're probably too wet. Okay, transplanting. Again, I mentioned err on the later side, use frost protection. You really don't want to put them in a situation where it's too cold because they're just not going to grow. And also don't plant them in the middle of a heat wave. You know, if you're going to have a couple days where it's extremely hot, which we do in June, avoid those days. Just wait a little bit. It's best if you can plant when it's overcast or morning or evening, you know, just so that they have a little bit of cool time to sort of survive that stress and start to acclimate. If you're doing something that requires staking, get that in place right at the time of planting so that you don't cause root damage down the line. And make sure your soil is the proper pH, loose and well aerated. You've got an expert on soil and regenerative soil practices right there among you. He can give you some amazing information about getting better soil health and getting your beds ready for spring. Here's one of my tricks that I love for tomatoes is putting it in on its side so that the stems make extra roots. But one of the things you do want to be careful about that they're not showing in this picture is you really don't want to have your tomato leaves in contact with the soil, just because there are so many soil-borne diseases. So it's good to have a little bit of mulch like grass clippings or leaves, newspaper, anything in there as a barrier between your tomato leaves and the soil. But you do want to bury that root nice and deep, or your stem, so you get extra roots. Okay, you can add other things at the time of planting. They're not necessary, but they can be helpful. Mycorrhizae bacteria or inoculum. These are formulations of microorganisms that increase growth. There are starter fertilizers out there, usually not needed. I usually let the plants settle in a little bit before I feed them. Compost and manure, just make sure it's not seedy. Mulch, I'm a big fan of mulch. And then as far as pest controls goes, really only use those if there's a need for them, and then be very careful about what you use and be sure you read the label. For direct sowing, check your forecast. Again, you don't want extreme conditions. You can either spend your time sowing carefully, or you can thin down the line. Know what to look for when your seedlings germinate, and be ready to keep an eye on your babies for a little while. Look out for pests and predators, and have your markers ready even before you go outside. I mentioned row covers. Those will allow you to not only get an earlier start, but also to keep your plants happier and free of pests and diseases in the early season. You can get just basic row covers, or you can go all the way up to fancy high tunnels, right? Okay, winter sowing. This is what I wanted to tell you about. We're actually going to have a workshop in our office in the 26th if anybody wants to come down our way. But basically, you use milk jugs, deli containers, whatever, as mini greenhouses. And you can do this time of year for so many varieties. You don't need lights, heat. You just literally put soil into these vessels, set them out in the snow, and let nature take its course. And I believe, yep, this is how you make a winter sowing jug. You basically take a milk jug, poke some holes in it, use a drill, whatever you want to do, slice it in half, fill it with soil, plant your seeds, tape it up, put it outside in the snow, and you'll get the natural stratification, a little extra warmth, and you will get big, healthy seedlings right around the time you want them. They know when to germinate. The things you can plant now are your cool loving hardy annuals like larkspur, scabiosa, a lot of your flower varieties you can do this with. Things like parsley, celery, onions, broccoli. Hold off a month or 2 or 3 on your tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. You can do those, but you just don't want to subject them to any really extremely cold temperatures outside. Once you get germination, when you have nice weather, you can just open them up and let them enjoy the sunshine. They'll be naturally hardened off and ready to go into the garden. Saving seed is really fun, and more people are doing it. You want to focus on your open pollinated varieties, not your hybrids. You want to be careful if you're growing multiple varieties, whether or not things cross-pollinate, just for the purity, if you want the same characteristics in the offspring. There's so many videos online. I'm not going to go too detailed on how to do this, but many varieties, you can just literally take the flowering heads off, shake the seeds out, and you'll have yours for next year. Things like beans and peas, you just let them dry on the vine and collect the dried seeds. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, you need to soak the seed to remove the fruit. Then you dry those and store them. And seed, whether you've harvested yourself or purchased it, you do need to store it in a cool, dry, dark place. I just use shoe boxes for the most part. My basement's rather damp, so I just keep them in a dark room that we don't use. You can add silica gel that you get in your shoe boxes. That will also absorb moisture. Some people store their seeds in the refrigerator. We need our refrigerator for food, and I have so many seeds that wouldn't fly. So I generally don't do that except for a few varieties. If you do hold your seed from year to year, you can do a simple little germination test on wet paper towels several weeks before your sowing date, just to make sure it's still viable. Okay, and this is my ending slide. I hope I didn't, I was pretty close to the right amount of time. And I just love this quote by Robert Louis Stevenson. Don't judge each day by the harvest you reap, but by the seeds that you plant. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions? You come do my garden for me?
I'd love to.
A lot of information, thank you.
Yes, thank you for your time, Carla.
Carl, I have a question for you. It's Garrett.
Sure.
So I'm thinking of doing a different tomato strategy this year. I always start so many tomatoes. I end up with lots and lots of extras. And I'm thinking of just concentrating on, because if we really use maybe 8 to 10 plants worth of tomatoes, is more than enough for us. Is there any reason why one couldn't start in the bigger pots rather than doing the succession up, from the small to the bigger? Is there any disadvantage to that?
No, not at all. It's just more, if you have the space to do it, absolutely.
Mhm.
And that saves them the stress of having to be bumped up. You just want to keep an eye on the moisture, and yeah. And to a risk is that if you don't know the viability of your seeds, you might have some empty pots, and then that's just a whole lot of media that's kind of just sitting there. So I'd recommend in that situation, if you have the seeds, maybe put 2 or 3 in a pot and cull them, and just leave your strongest seedling standing.
Good to know. Thank you.
I got a question. I know everything we've talked about is putting things in the garden. when you're using like a raised bed or an enclosed bed, are there any quick tips that you give about being successful with what you're growing?
I think a lot of it has to do with timing, making sure that you're putting it out when it wants to be put out, do those cool season levers, your spinach and greens, radishes, things like that in the very early season, from like April and May. And then really, try to maximize your productivity then, things that can go pretty quickly, so that then that frees up space for your warm loving plants like your tomatoes and squash, so that you can possibly get 2 crops out of one space. If you can't do that, I think it's just really important to make sure you don't have bare soil at any time. So that time that the bed's not in use, keep it mulched with either shredded leaves, or I mentioned the silage tarp, bark chips. Just we're learning more and more that bare soil is a no-no. And if you keep it mulched and healthy, then whatever you're going to put into it when the time comes is going to thrive.
Thank you.
You mentioned that it was a black fabric or a black material that you put on the soil. Would newspaper have the same effect or not really?
It would actually. It's not going to get it as hot where it'll kill off the seeds, but it will certainly smother them. And so, one option is to just plant right into the newspaper, which some people do. But I've heard that it could interfere to some degree with gas exchange between the soil and the environment. So, it just depends on the thickness and the extent to what you do it. But, cardboard is another option that people use. You also have the option of just mulching your pathways. Instead of having the growing space open, but mulch those pathways that always get so weedy and out of control. And then you're only focusing on weeding a small area.
Thank you.
And pathways are a good place to put wood chips. And often you get wood chips for free or very low cost from landscapers who are looking for a place to dump off trees after they've chipped them. I know that
Yes, it's so wonderful. If you can get that stuff, it's the best, especially for your perennials and things like that you don't have to dig into very often.
The undyed, right? Undyed.
Yeah, so if the landscapers are doing it, they're just doing it straight from the chipper. I mean, the
Mhm.
real issue is, I don't know how many live in town versus outside of town, but you would need a little bit of storage space because they want to dump off like a landscaper load at a time. So I've had some, and I have a pile of, I have 2 actually piles of wood chips the size of this table here and about 4 feet tall. Because I
Lucky.
have a lot of land, and I had some trees taken down. But they
Our
all.
county drops off chips, just from road work, about a mile from our house. And so for Christmas, well, right before Christmas, they put a big pile out, and my son got me, I think, 5 truckloads for my Christmas present.
I'm sure we could check here in Herkimer with the Herkimer DEC or the
Right.
Herkimer DPW.
Oh,
Right.
absolutely.
They usually have a stump
Yeah.
dump or something, they dump it there as well.
Yeah, that's the best stuff. And it's slow to break down compared to the commercial stuff that you buy, and you don't have the ugly dyes in it.
As long as it's not dyed.
No, thank you.
Nothing dyed, yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah, and it's gonna be hard to find undyed, even cedar mulch. It's crazy. Around here you've got brown, black, and red.
Right, which is when you buy stuff at Lowe's, it's all dyed.
Yeah, and that's basically just latex paint that's in there.
I had like 3 or 4 pine trees that I had them cut down. And I told them to leave the chips.
Oh, nice.
Me, well, that was a mistake and a half because I had no idea how much wood chips there were in 3 large pine trees.
Yes, there's a lot.
Like, oh my God. But I finally managed to, put that where I wanted them. The only problem was, I guess they're too, got too high in acidity, the pine tree chips. And the first 2 years, nothing grew.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then now it is, this year.
Right, it
this
should
past
break
year,
down, so it's not, and you can
Or
always,
maybe high nitrogen, is that what it is?
well, no, they absorb nitrogen. The
Okay.
chips absorb nitrogen, so that is an issue. If it's
Okay.
fresh wood, that's why you put it in the walkways rather than on top of the bed. But you would want to add more nitrogen-based fertilizer than you would normally to overcome that, because as they break down, they're absorbing nitrogen.
That's why nothing. was
Yeah,
too
they
high.
shouldn't throw off the acidity all that
So I
much,
should have actually maybe mixed it with more like carbon.
or just let it rot for
Yeah.
the humus for a season or two.
Okay.
There's a blog called The Garden Professors, or there's a Facebook group. I think they have a blog too, like a garden myths blog. But they've actually done a lot of research on wood chips, and they feel like that they can be applied pretty fresh without too much concern. But the key is to do it nice and deep so that you're not getting the weeds.
Well, great. Any other questions?
I think we're good. Carla,
Great. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Yeah.
Bye.
Carla, thank you.
You're welcome.